Thanks for staying with us. The arrest of former Speaker of Parliament of the National Assembly, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, has again resuscitated the debate about whether or not the National Prosecuting Authority is doing enough to arrest the so-called big fish accused of state capture. Now, since the Zondo Commission's report, for example, and since it was finalised, there was a lot of focus on whether or not there would be more high-profile arrests. So, can we still say that things are moving at a snail's pace? Let's have this discussion now and speak to Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution Executive Secretary, Lawson Naidoo. Lawson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting to us this afternoon. I mean, you argue that the perception that the NPA is dysfunctional and does not go after the big fish is unfair. Tell us why.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Yes, I don't think the NPA is given enough credit for the work that has been done in recent years to rebuild an institution that was already decimated during the state capture era. So when the new leadership under Advocate Shamila Batoy came in 5 years ago, they really had to start from a very low base in rebuilding the institution, rebuilding morale, recruiting new staff. Many skilled staff had left in the earlier years. So there was a lot of work to be done. And I think, we need to acknowledge that. We also need to acknowledge the efforts that have been made by the NPA. And I think we would all agree, I think including the NPA, that they would have liked to have been further down the line in terms of prosecutions and laying of charges against people. But what I argued in the piece yesterday was that we can't look at the NPA in isolation from other elements of the fight against corruption. It's not just about the NPA. They're effectively at the end of a chain of investigations and so on that ultimately leads to the decision to prosecute. And of course, if they don't have sufficient evidence to take a case before court, they can't do that. And, there is also a misconception that they could simply take what was the information that was provided to the Zondo Commission and take that to court and secure convictions. Well, unfortunately, that's not how it works. They have to do their own investigations. They have to corroborate the evidence. They've got to get the documentary trails, if they're able to, before they can take a decision to go to court. And I think what the NPA has been outlining is that they have been making progress, that the asset forfeiture unit has seized significant amounts of money. There have been many prosecutions. We haven't seen anyone in orange overalls as yet, absolutely. But, I think what we've seen is a commitment from the NPA to prosecute without fear, favour or prejudice. And I think that's been demonstrated most recently with the arrest and charging of the former Speaker of the National Assembly.
Lawson, what then do you say? I mean, especially when you look at the fact that each time they would appear in Parliament year in, year out, they talk about the issue of resources and how, financially strained they are. How important is it to also strengthen that part in order to ensure that their work is also done, diligently and on time?
No, absolutely. The NPA requires resources, as many state institutions do, and we understand we're operating in a fiscally a very difficult environment, and that there is a political commitment from the Minister of Justice to try and mobilize the resources that are required by the NPA, but there's still a long way to go to achieve that. The other important thing about the NPA is that they need to have their independence. They were a line item in the budget of the Department of Justice, and they don't have their own budgets secured. Operationally, in terms of the administration of the NPA, they still report to Parliament, for example, through the Department of Justice and not directly. And there are certain things that could be done to enhance the independence of the NPA and its efficiency. And those are issues I think we need to look at. The recent legislation, the passing of the NPA Amendment Bill that creates the Investigating Directorate as a permanent body is a step in the right direction. It will certainly enable the Investigating Directorate to now hire staff on, not on a short-term contract, but on a long-term basis. And that gives them the ability to attract staff of the necessary skills that they require, forensic investigative analysts and the like. So I think this is a process. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet. But I think, when we have a discussion around the fight against corruption, we've got to also look at the other mechanisms that the Zondo reports highlighted, What do we need to do to strengthen public procurement issues? The steps that needed to be taken to remove undue executive influence over senior appointments in the public service and the like. Additional protection for whistleblowers. Those are all key building blocks in the broader fight against corruption. And if we don't address those and simply focus on the NPA, then we're only focusing on one aspect of the fight against corruption.
And it's quite an important one, especially when you think about the protection for whistleblowers, for example, and how that also impacts the work of the NPA, because people sometimes don't feel comfortable to come forward and therefore they miss out on critical information. But Lawson, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one. How much of the perception as well would you say is also based on some of the cases that we would have seen that are linked to state capture, for example, the performance of the NPA, that is in the Nulane matter, for example, and we saw just how that fell apart, and a lot of people said, but you are not ready.
No, and that's a valid criticism, although we must also acknowledge that the Nulane judgment is being taken on appeal. The NPA felt that the first court got it wrong, that evidence that they had presented should have been admitted. And we've got to be cognizant of the fact, and this relates to the issue you raised just now around whistleblowers. Investigating and prosecuting corruption cases is difficult because there's very rarely a clear paper trail. A lot of the stuff is done off book and so on. And if you don't have whistleblowers that come forward and expose that, it's very difficult to get to the bottom of it. And the courts need to be cognizant of that. And the NPA needs to be able to present the best case it can in order to prove the commission of the crimes that are there. So I think we've got to understand all of that. The Nulane judgments have been taken on appeal. I know the NPA came in for a lot of criticism with regards to the failed extradition of the Guptas from the UAE. But if one looks at that, was not anything to do with anything that the NPA had done wrong, but was more a reflection of the legal system in the United Arab Emirates. And we must also acknowledge that the NPA didn't argue that case through the Department of Justice and DERCO. The extradition application is made, and we rely on the counterparts in the UAE to effectively prosecute that matter on our behalf.
And speaking about another arm in the corruption fight as well is the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, for example, which was adopted by Cabinet. And there's been a lot of talk around this, especially the prevention, good governance, transparency, and all of that. But would you say since 2020, since we saw its adoption, there's been any movement in that regard?
Well, once again, I think we would have to say that there's been some movement, but perhaps not enough movement. We've seen the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which is mandated at the moment to oversee and monitor the implementation of that National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which covers the issues I've mentioned earlier, around procurement, public service reform, transparency, integrity and good governance, protection for whistleblowers. And the NACAC needs to step up, needs to become more voluble in its in what it is saying. And make it clear that there is, an overall strategy, what they call a whole of society approach. Because if all of us don't roll up our sleeves and take part in this fight, we're not going to win the fight against corruption.
It definitely needs to be a coherent one. Thank you so much, Lawson. Do appreciate your time as you speak about these different pieces that need to come together to make this puzzle effective and how critical they really are. I mean, it was the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution Executive Secretary, Lawson Naidoo.